Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stevens with a lecture for contemporary religious poetry. Of course, I'm teaching this spring semester 2018. We're going to call this particular lecture The Absence, and the purpose of the lecture is to give you an introduction to reading religious poetry. We're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of poetry and maybe try to get some insight into how we can identify a poem as a religious poem, if you will. So I'm going to begin by reading The Absence, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of its characteristics. So here we go. The Absence is a poem in our textbook, The Turning Aside. You can find it on, I think it's page 8, but you can look that up uh, in the table of contents, The Absence by R.S. Thomas. It is this great absence that is like a presence that compels me to address it without hope of a reply. It is a room I enter from which someone has just gone, the vestibule for the arrival of one who has not yet come. I modernize the anachronism of my language, but he is no more here than before. Genes and molecules have no more power to call him up than the incense of the Hebrews at their altars. My equations fail as my words do. What resources have I other than the emptiness without him of my whole being, a vacuum he may not abhor? Let's start right there with the fact that I just read this poem out loud to you. And what I mean is the difference between reading the words silently to yourself on the page and reading them out loud. And I mention this because hearing is such an aid to understanding when it comes to reading poetry. And sometimes I think that even if the reading does not bring out meaning in a conventional sense, it gives you a gut feeling for the meaning of the poem. It's kind of like the onomatopoeia of the sound of the words. Onomatopoeia simply means that the sound of a word in some way indicates the meaning of the word, like the word splash sounds like something falling into water, right? That's onomatopoeia. And the point here is simply that the sound of a poem is in some way related to its meaning, even if you can't put that meaning into words. Poetry has an ancient history, and that history goes all the way back to music, when poems really were in some way chanted or sung, very often to the accompaniment of a musical instrument. So, you with me on this? Poetry originally is intimately connected with music. Now, think about music. Think about if you didn't actually hear a song, but you could read the notes. Suppose you had the score, all right? That is the printed notes printed on uh, a piece of paper. You had the score for that, and those notes represented the tune, right? And then you could read the words, but you wouldn't have the song, would you? You don't have the song until someone actually sings it and you can hear the music. Well, reading a poem out loud is a lot like that. You are hearing the music of the poetry. So we begin there by saying, first of all, read the poem out loud, do the best you can, and see if that doesn't help you understand. Now, what makes this a poem? And by that question, I mean, what is definitive? Right? Definition means, this is very important, identifying what makes something unique that is different from everything else, all right? Definitive. What makes it unique? What are those things that it has that separates it from everything else? That's the definition. So let's look at some of these things. First of all, figurative language, such as metaphor and simile, a lot of times when people are talking uh, about poetry, they'll say, well, you can tell a poem because it uses a lot of figurative language. Well, that's fine. Very often you will find figurative language in a poem, and we'll look at some of the figurative language in the absence. But that's not what makes poetry unique. It's not what separates it from other kinds of writing, because other kinds of writing, stories, novels, and so on, can use figurative language, and they do as well. All right? So the figurative language is not what sets a poem aside, makes it unique. I want to suggest that what defines a poem, that is, makes it definitive, is compression. Okay? The meaning in a poem is extremely compact, more compact than it is even in other kinds of writing, which might use very concise language, right? But you're never going to find a I want to get rid of that. You're not going to find a literary work that is as compact as is a poem. And we see that, first of all, and we're talking about lyric poetry here, by the way, lyrics as in the lyrics to a song. All right, and if you look at the printed lyrics to a song printed on the page, you will definitely see that they are about the same length as a lyric poem. Okay, so a lyric poem is short. How many lines to the absence? I haven't counted them, but we've got 4 stanzas of 4 lines each. We've got a total of 16 lines. Okay, and suppose there's an average of, say, 6, okay, or maybe even as many as 10 words to a line on average. We're not going to have more than 150 or 160 words. It's short. But it's not just its shortness that's important here. Its meaning is compact. It's compressed. Now, how does a poem do this? How does it make things compact and compressed? Well, let's look at the very first line of this poem. It is this great absence that is like a presence that compels me to address it without hope of a reply. All right? Now, this poem never comes right out and says what the great absence is. There are clues to the absence here, very, very, very definite clues. But those clues are all forms of reference and allusion. And this is one of the ways in which a poet achieves compression, compactness, conciseness in poetry. By instead of coming right out and explaining things in detail, all right, that's what you do in an essay, right? A poet will allude to things. So let's look at, well, there are a lot of allusions in this poem, but here is an allusion to a fairly well-known idea or phrase, a vacuum he may not abhor. And you may have heard the expression, nature abhors a vacuum. All right? What's a vacuum? A vacuum is an area of no pressure, right? What's a vacuum cleaner? Vacuum cleaner reduces the pressure inside the vacuum so that things can be, as we say, sucked into it. Well, what that means is that things that are outside the vacuum cleaner in an area of higher pressure will move into the low pressure of the vacuum. And that's what we mean when we say nature abhors a vacuum, meaning that if there is a low pressure area, okay, nature's going to send something in there to fill it. But notice, this a vacuum he may not abhor, certainly, although it is a reference to that famous idea or well known idea, not talking about nature, it's talking about he, right? So, question then is, who is he? All right, well, there are references to a he in the poem, but where do we get to the he? We don't get to he until the third stanza, right? Okay, so we do have a someone, perhaps. It is a room I enter from which someone has just gone. Well, we might say, oh, well, maybe the someone is the he, but we can't be sure, right? Then we get this: genes and molecules have no more power to call him up. Here's that he again, right? Have no more power to call him up. Okay, so genes and molecules, what do we mean? I don't know. I mean, that is an allusion to something, and the reader cannot always tell exactly what is being alluded to. But we know that genes, Gene, refers to genetic material, and we know that genetic material is the basis of life, right? And we know that living things are made up of molecules, so the poet could be referring to some kind of life form. All right. So let's say that that's what he's doing. Let's see if that works. Because you say, well, I'm not exactly sure what the genes and molecules are, but it could be a reference to a life form. Will that work in this poem? So genes and molecules, let's substitute life form. Life forms have no more power to call him up. Ah, okay, so life form can't call on this him, whoever this is, this him, right? Okay, well, all right, we do know that life forms can call on things, right? So, and then we get this incense of the Hebrews. Now let's see how that works. Okay, the incense of the Hebrews. Now, what incense is this? Well, it's the incense on their altars. All right, now, I don't think that you need me to tell you that altar is a religious term, right? Altar refers to that structure, okay? It can be a table, it can be a structure made out of stone, but a structure that is used for some kind of religious sacrifice. And so the altar then is going to be something that here we've got in the fourth stanza, we finally get to something that helps us identify who the he is, right? Okay? And I don't need to tell you that the incense of the Hebrews at their altars would be incense that's being offered to the Hebrew God. All right? So we can put that in there. We can write this in: he equals God. And that then becomes our hypothesis, if you will. There is no explicit reference to God here in this poem, but there is all of this language that alludes to a hymn until we finally get to that word altar and we say, oh, I'll bet he's talking about God. So then we go back and we start reading God into the poem. But let's not lose sight of what we're talking about. We're talking about compression, right, folks? We're talking about compression. We're talking about the way in which meaning is really compact in this poem. And it's compact through the use of allusion and reference. Now, there are other ways of making meaning compact. I'm not saying this is the only way of doing it. What I am saying is, to get back to the beginning of this little talk, what I am saying is that there is something that defines the lyric poem that makes it unique, that separates it from other kinds of language. And I'm saying that what that is compression. That is putting a lot of meaning into a few words. And one of the ways in which it does this is through allusion and reference. Now, it is also true, certainly, that the use of figurative language, such as metaphor, is another way to do this. Metaphor is another way of compressing meaning into a small space, if you will. So, let's have a look at a few metaphors here. Okay. Now, notice I said that what's being alluded to, the he in this poem, is God. We haven't really read God back into the poem, have we? Okay, we need to do that. That's very important. But we're still talking about the way in which meaning is compressed. All right? So we say there's an absence that is like a presence. That's not a metaphor, that's a simile. A simile is an explicit comparison between two things. Absence here, okay, we're comparing it to presence. We've got that word like, all right? And like is one of the words that identifies a simile because it comes right out and says, I'm comparing one thing and seeing how it's like another thing. But we're dealing with two very abstract things, absence and presence. Okay, something is absent, right? What could be absent would be your car from the parking space where you left it, right? That could be an absence, right? So we need to go along and find out what this absence might be. Okay, now this is an absence that the speaker is saying it's a presence that compels me to address it. You're going to be talking to this absence. And when I do address it, I don't have any hope that it's going to talk back to me. Oh, well, now this absence is starting to get a little personal, isn't it? It's no longer your car that's missing from the parking space. It's not that kind of absence. And then we go on. We say, oh, this absence is a room. All right? It's a room I enter from which someone has just gone. Now, that's a metaphor. Okay, absence is just absence. It's the abstract idea of something not being there, right? But a metaphor takes an abstract idea. It is not necessarily an abstract idea with a metaphor, but it very often is. It takes an abstract idea and it puts it in concrete terms. Now, a room is not an absence, okay? So a metaphor takes one thing and expresses it in terms of something that is completely different. Now, have you ever had the experience of walking into a room and having the sense that someone was just there, but they're not there anymore, right? So it is a room from which someone has just gone. Or another metaphor. This absence is a vestibule, right? The vestibule is the part of a house that where you enter, right? Like the lobby. Okay, so this absence can be a room that someone has just left, or it could be the vestibule where someone is about to arrive but hasn't yet come, and so on. All right? Now, we could go on and on and on. The point here is that this metaphor and also the simile, right? These metaphors are trying to capture something. We haven't said what it is yet, but it's trying to capture something, a great absence. It's trying to capture it in a few words, and it's compressing that absence into this metaphor, or these two metaphors here. All right. So we've talked about compression, we've talked about the use of allusion and reference, and now we've talked a little bit about figurative language, metaphor, and simile. How, I need to get this phrase that I wrote here, I need to get this out of the poem. Does it work to read God back into this poem? And if we do, then where is it? Okay. He becomes God. Now, how do we know? Well, we've been using the clues that are offered by especially the incense of Hebrews and the altar, right? So that's an allusion to something, right? And that's something we say, okay, well, maybe he's talking about God. And if he is, then he's talking about the absence of God. Okay? So you see how this works? R.S. Thomas could have written an essay about how he experiences God being absent in his life, right? And he could have explained that. He could have said things like, I'm talking about God, right? But he wants to put this into the compressed form of a poem. And what does it do then? Being in this poetic form, what does it do that it can't do in an essay? I want to suggest that it's a little bit like a treasure hunt, and you go on that treasure hunt and you're following clues, and my goodness, you get really lucky, and finally you find that treasure. Now, you probably don't do treasure hunts but if you're a parent, right, you might have a treasure hunt for your kids on their birthday party, or when you were a child, maybe you went on a treasure hunt, but you know what I'm talking about. You follow those clues, and what happens when you get to that treasure? There's that sense of excitement that you wouldn't have if, instead of putting you on that treasure hunt, your parent just sat down and said, okay, now, if you go out in the yard and you go, first of all, you go through the garden and you go up to this tree, and then you go around this bush, and then you're going to find your present. There wouldn't be that sense of excitement. There wouldn't be that aha moment that can even send chills up and down your spine when you say, oh, I know what he's talking about. Folks, that's all I'm going to say about the absence and about poetry right now. I'm just going to leave you with one parting word, and I'm going to say, okay, so we look for a theme in a poem. In a religious poem, we look for a religious theme, and we say, okay, in this poem, then the theme is the absence of God. Now, notice I haven't said a lot about the absence of God and the significance of that, but that is a very important theme in religious poetry, and we will be taking this up as we go along in this course. And by the way, this lecture is the second of two on this subject of reading religious poetry. Thank you for listening. I hope that that lecture, I was going to say, I hope the lecture will help you in your reading of religious poetry.